Atamaria te whānau te Harangawaka. Welcome, kia ora. It's great to see everybody here for the first, I think this is probably the first event in town since we went to level 1, so it's a good feeling. It's great to be close with you here, and it's fantastic to welcome you to this event. My name is Stephen Cummings. I'm Professor of Strategy and Innovation here at Te Harangawaka, Victoria University of Wellington, and also with my colleague Dr. Jesse Pirini, who's there on the end of of our panel. We look after the Atom, Te Kahu Te Ao Innovation Space, which is our hub for innovation and entrepreneurship here at Te Harangawaka. It's great to be here with a fantastic panel. We have a very special guest, Brad Olsen, someone who I'm sure you've seen a lot of recently. And if your reaction to seeing Brad on the telly and on social media is anything like mine, your first reaction is probably, how old is he? Is he really? Is that? And I think for us, it's a double whammy, because we do look and we see Brad and we think, wasn't he in our class? Was he in classes just a couple of years ago? Brad's rise has been meteoric. It's not such a surprise to us, because I think even when he was here as a student, we knew that Brad was destined for great things, and it's fantastic to have him here with us to talk about how do we innovate our way out of COVID or post-COVID world. Now, it's a great shame that we are not able to be joined by Napara Riley from Figure NZ. Just in the last 24 hours, Napara fell ill. We understand that she's doing well, but she sends her best wishes, her regards. But we are really lucky that we have Dr. Jesse Pirini, and Jesse has been doing some really interesting work in terms of economic strategies here in Te Whanganui, Atara, the Wellington region, with the Greater Wellington Regional Council. So he's got some really interesting insights in terms of what recovery means for the Maori economy, particularly in this region. So we're really lucky to be here together, to have such a great panel. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. This is Wellington, so we have to tell you about what happens in the event of an earthquake. Just drop, cover and hold. If you feel an earthquake, wait till it passes. Maria or Caroline, Jesse or myself, we will guide you out the front door. Our gathering point is just here, conveniently located on Bunny Street. If you need the bathrooms, they're out of the door to the right here, towards the end of the building. Men's and women's and gender-neutral toilets towards the end of the building there. And I think that's all we need to say, except for the very important fact, there's a slight, if you've been to one of these breakfasts before, you may have noticed a slight change, and that is that the food arrives after the talking. So don't panic. There is catering on the way. If you thought, well, it's okay because I'll get a Danish at that thing that I'm going to, you will. It's just that you have to listen to us first. So do not.
That's
panic.
a pretty good bribe.
It is, and it's also an incentive for us to get through our points quickly and concisely. I'll get the ball rolling. I'll ask these guys some questions, but there'll also be time for your questions. So when we get to the end, or if there's a burning issue that happens partway through, just put up your hand and ask your question. And really, this is an informal gathering to hear from these experts on how do we innovate our way out. So that's the topic today. Okay. Thank you for that. And what I really wanted to start with is to talk to Brad about the unique perspective that he has, traveling around Aotearoa, seeing what he's seen over the last 6 months. It's really interesting to me, and I'm sure interesting to you as well, to ask Brad, what does he see as he travels around the country? What are some of the really encouraging signs in terms of innovation? And then maybe what are some of the barriers that might stop us as we move forward? So, Brad, Thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting to see where New Zealand is positioned, and I guess there's a couple key drivers of what we're seeing out there in terms of what's driving the economy generally, but also what's driving those regional economies. So the last 6 months has taken me in person to the likes of all the way from Whangarei up north to Queenstown, down in Otago, and everywhere in between, and Zoom meetings galore, as I'm sure everyone's been doing. What's interesting is seeing that there's a lot of pain out there. Businesses are doing it tough, people are doing it tough, but the key drivers of that are quite different. So if you look at somewhere like Queenstown, tourism, 60% of their economy, there's a lot of focus there in one specific industry, which doesn't have as many people coming through. So those sort of areas are doing it tough, but also trying to figure out, well, what do you do as an economy when you don't have tourists, and when it's probably not likely that tourists are going to come back just like that. The other end of the spectrum, you go up to somewhere like Kaipara, the place of the Kumara. It's a completely different area. You're looking at agriculture, you're looking at those sort of elements. They're doing a lot better. They haven't really noticed as much of a difference. They don't have quite as many Aucklanders coming up to Mangawhai, but that's sort of a separate issue. They quite enjoy that, actually. I'm sure the Aucklanders would rather be up at the beach. But so you've got those sort of challenges. In other areas, you've got construction, which is quite a key driver of their economy. Whangarei is one good example where that sort of stuff is proceeding all right at the minute. But you talk to builders and they're saying, I'm all right for the next 9 months, but after that I don't really know if there's any activity. So there's a lot of different compartments there that I think we're yet to see how they are playing out. What is interesting, though, is that when this crisis happened, I'm sure everyone in this room will have done something similar. That wash of what is next, that complete uncertainty that came through was quite clear. What was good to see across almost every region I talked to was that they immediately said, look, we've got to come together, we've got to put our competition aside, whether we're a chamber of commerce, a council, a business or whoever. There was this real strong sort of community sense that buy local came through very clearly. All of those elements were quite a really strong part of that cohesion you saw at a regional level, and so that's been quite instructive. What I do always say to a Wellington audience like this, and I expect, who here is actually from Wellington, sort of born and bred, or who's more like me from Whangarei and moved down? Oh, a few, okay, so if quite a few of you have still, I expect, to talk to mum and dad or family or friends out in other parts of the country, and so hopefully you'll have gotten a better perspective. The thing I'm always worried about in Wellington is that we do have the public sector, and that's generally a pretty safe job market. Walking down Lambton Quay, talking to some key decision makers, they think everything's fine, and it's not fine, and I do want to sort of press that point that things are not all right yet. They are on a better path, though, so that's the more encouraging sign from a regional perspective.
That's great. It's interesting you talk about that, the community spirit and people putting competition to one side. And obviously we've all heard about the team of 5 million. Do you think that's going to continue post-COVID, that community spirit?
I'd like to think so. What we did quite quickly see, and actually this was advice to many people we talked about throughout lockdown, is that in a crisis, with such uncertainty, the need for change is quite persistent. You sort of survive or die is how many people sort of look at it. And so talking to people across the regions, what was quite clear is that sometimes there wasn't a comprehensive strategy of, you'd have so many different organisations doing so many different things that you could be killing one bird with about 20 stones instead of one bird with, or two birds with the same stone. So what we saw quite quickly was that people said, look, what can I bring to the table and lay down, and therefore what can I also pick up? And so it was a bit of one of those community boxes. I think moving forward there's more collaboration because people recognise that actually it works quite well. If you can get the entire region on board, if you can share some good resources, if you make sure you're talking to ministers or local decision makers and getting some cash in hand for your region, that's actually quite advantageous. And there's an element of having to bridge or walk a very fine line in terms of regional storytelling. On one hand, you want to be upbeat to your local community because you want people to spend, you want people to feel like things are going all right. At the same time, you want Wellington and decision makers to think things are going awful because you need more cash to get things going. And there's a little bit of cynicism in there. But I think what we have seen is that people have said, look, not only do we want cash for investing in our sort of organisations, we also want it to be slightly more enduring. We don't just want it to be a flash in the pan. We help through the next 6 months and then it's all done. We're seeing people that are going, look, we've wanted to do this project for 10 years. This is the time that it will really make a step change in our economy. So I think that's been quite nice to see that transition of this is going to work not only for us now, but for us into the future.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I'm interested now to ask Jesse, as you've kind of been travelling around this region, thinking about developing strategies with particular emphasis on the Maori economy, with Te Matarau a Maui, that project. What sort of surprised you, or what sort of interested you in terms of possibility for innovation now and post-COVID?
Two things have kind of come up for me recently. So as part of the strategy development, we went round the wider Greater Wellington region, and the first thing that came out for me was, so I was born in Wellington, grew up in Wellington, is the diversity of the region. So if you go out to Featherston, to the Wairarapa, it's a really different economy. And for me living here in central Wellington, I didn't really see that. Along the Kapiti coast, very different, with Transmission Gully coming in. So there's a lot of things changing, and there's actually a lot of diversity in this economy. But two things struck me. So the first thing was, the second we went into lockdown, and I realised that I wasn't particularly resilient. I think I was all right mentally resilient, but financially resilient. After a few weeks of not earning a salary, I would be in quite a lot of trouble. And I think, reflecting on that, we live in a time of relative comparative wealth, and yet if we stop doing what we're doing, suddenly it's all over. And I think in terms of an innovation, to innovate our way out, we need to become a more resilient economy that doesn't have to rely on, it would be nice to not have to constantly earn money, right? To kind of get off this sort of hamster wheel. So going around the communities, this idea of the diversity in Wellington, the link to resilience that I saw in the communities is that when we talked about economic development, people were saying, it's not actually just about money for us. For us, money it's a means to an end. And the communities we talked to were saying, when I start a business, when I think about economic development, there's all sorts of other things that I want to come out of that business. And we're starting to see it with the wellbeing economy across the whole of government. But some of the things people were talking about in terms of value that they get from a business, one of the really interesting ones was political value. So the ability to have a voice. So economic development to some of these groups meant that they were able to have a voice to make more decisions within their local community. And so resilience through companies that can produce multiple types of value. And on the way in this morning, I started thinking of this idea of, instead of too big to fail, too useful to fail. So can we make companies that are delivering multiple streams of value? I think that is potentially a really useful innovation, and something that I was seeing in the communities. People were asking for that kind of thing.
Can I just pick up on something that you mentioned there, Jesse, in terms of the composition? I think that's probably an important story, probably for this group as well, to recognise is that that is one of the innovations that sort of, it's not something we're going to consciously do, we've already done it because of lockdown. That is, this working from home element. If you look at where people are concentrated and where people work, but also where people spend, Wellington City's been hit really hard there. Activity in the city itself is pretty low most days because more people are working from home. But you go out to Porirua, the Hutt, Kapiti, or over to the Wairarapa, their spending numbers are in a very strong position. And I think that's showing that people are, it goes back to not only too useful to fail, but also what people want out of life. And that's not always a 9 to 5 in an office. That's saying, well, actually, look, I do want to spend more time with the kids. I do want to go out running. I do want to, play my drums or whatever it is. And people are saying, well, actually, I can do both now a bit more. Now, it's not suited everyone. I struggled my way through lockdown in front of my ironing board, which wasn't particularly good. I don't know how everyone else's setups went, but that's something I think we're going to see more of as well, is this remote working and the potential for commuting says to people, particularly, you know, younger people who generally speaking are a bit more tech savvy, that you can choose a little bit more where you want to live and what that lifestyle looks like. So it's not just work, get to 65, retire, move on. Like the life phasing has changed in a sense.
I think that leads really nicely into this this idea. You know, we're talking here about how do we innovate our way out, but it's a really interesting question about, well, what is the out that we want to get to? You know, there's been a lot of talk in the UK and the US, and I think here as well, about building back better. So not just getting back to where we were, but actually seeing this as an opportunity to do things a little bit differently. And one of the things I really like about Brad's analysis and the work that Jesse does is you guys don't just look at GDP. And I think that's a really interesting kind of development, and it's kind of, I suppose, a meta innovation. It's not inventing a better light bulb or a mousetrap. It's actually thinking about what we're innovating for. So I'm really interested, and maybe we'll start with you, Brad, to ask what does better look like in terms of from an economist point of view, what are we measuring? And how will we measure, and how might that change our lives going forward?
I think one of the key ones is jobs, and that's for two reasons. One, it makes sense. You have a job that does create opportunity, especially if you don't just do a job. But wider than that, it's also something we can count. Now, if I asked you how much GDP there might be in your company or anywhere else, who knows? I mean, economists revise that stuff all the time. If I ask you how many people work at your firm, you can count that. And for everyone in this room, you know what a job looks like. So it's measurable, it's tangible. For people, it makes sense and it's useful. And that's always a metric we look at. Certainly when we look at building back better, there's an element of resilience within different groups that we need to focus on. This downturn we know has hit particularly Māori. We saw that during the global financial crisis, that while non-Māori employment fell 2%, Māori employment fell something like 6.3%, you know, a much wider effect. We're seeing it particularly fall on young people, that, you know, if you're under 30, you've lost jobs at, so I think it's double the rate of those who are over 30. We know that women particularly have also seen their job losses come through, and all of those say that actually we've got a problem here, that there are some groups that are concentrated in certain types of work that we either don't value properly or don't value to the degree we should, and we need to be able to move people up, you know, instead of just keeping people at a certain level of employment. So jobs is one area that I think we certainly need to do a bit more work on and to measure more. Now, we've seen skills development and such, which is always good. I think what we probably need to have is a bit more of a national conversation about, if we've previously used migration to bring in skilled workers, and you know, any economist will tell you that that should be a short-term fix. New Zealand's short-term fixes existed for 30 plus years, because every time we identify that we need someone to drive, I don't know, a combine harvester or something, we go, yeah, we'll train someone up in a few years' time, and then we just keep pushing that out. So we do need to get smarter on those elements, and having people go into the areas that they can start to make money. That's sort of the core area for me, is that jobs focus, and why in that the skills focus, because we do have a changing economy. We are not going to have as much tourism moving forward. Anyone that says that tourism is going to snap back within 5 years is kidding themselves. That is changing the way we're doing things, and more there's not as much money to go around the economy as well. So you've got to get smarter. From a business perspective, you don't have that revenue coming in, but your costs are still relatively high. So we are also going to have to see digital innovation. You know, the fact that some people still don't do their accounts on Xero or some other platform is sort of scary to me, because using a math book, like, you know, I've seen small businesses do in previous times, that's prone to error, but more importantly, it's actually a real big time issue for businesses. So changing the way of thinking is going to be a really key way that we do that. That digital sort of revolution is sort of very much here.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, so jobs, I mean, it's so simple and basic, but it's really interesting that we just don't talk so much about jobs and how real that is in our lives. You know, skills development, I think that's, you know, crucial, obviously, you know, working in an educational institution. And I think also that the way that perhaps, you know, when we saw that with the COVID app, New Zealanders are reluctant to use the technology that could help them do the sort of analytics, I think, which would be really useful, even for a small business, being able to track, revenue or track costs, and then to be able to do some analytic work, I think would be, fantastic.
And it was interesting there. I mean, I don't know if you guys still have 5, 6, 7 different apps on your phone with all the different tracking systems and what have you that we had in the very early stages. Now, that was encouraging in one sense because it said, hey, we've got a lot of smart people who are doing a lot of great work, but it also highlighted that often we've got a lot of cooks in the mix, or we've got to, again, we're trying to kill one bird with multiple stones, and I think that's one area that we do also need to shift. Now, we keep talking about building back better, and everyone sort of says, well, is what we've got now not good enough? And no, it's not. We've got children in poverty that can't have breakfast. We've got, well, I was going to say we've got housing issues. We don't have housing. That is the issue. There are all those sort of areas, and again, you sort of say, okay, we don't have housing, so people are having bad health outcomes, they're not able to get to the right places, they're not able to live in the right spots. At the same time, we say, well, look, construction's going to take a big hit, so, why don't we allow for more development, because that will get housing, going. That's a great job earner. Construction is a hugely labour-intensive place, plus you get new houses. I mean, it's a real win-win. So I think for all of these things, we want to build back better so that when we do hit other crises, that we're in a better sort of net position to allow people to move forward, to have those opportunities, to have those sort of choices around whether or not they're working all the time, or if they're working and also enjoying life at the same time. So building back better to me means we do need to start to address some of our sort of systemic issues we've always had, because in a crisis, risk goes out the window. And in previous times it was too risky to, change development rules or do other bits and pieces. Now the risk that you do something and it fails is, well, you're already stuffed. So you may as well give something a crack, because if you fail, then, well, nothing's really happened.
That's right. It's half time and you're down by 50 points. So, you've got to do
miracle
something
out.
different. Yeah. You've got to pin your ears back. And no, I think it's a serious point. I think, we see through history in these times of crisis, that's where the sort of motivation for innovation can really, spark. Jesse, you talked about, when through Te Matara a Maui, traveling around the communities, diverse communities in this region. People were telling you, look, it's not just about money, it's not just about economics or finance. So what is it about? What do people in those communities want to see valued more highly if we do build back better?
For Māori communities, most of the time it's about tino rangatiratanga, so being basically in control of your own decisions, your own life. And in terms of building back better, I think there's 2 key things. One is better connections to community. So people being really situated where they are, feeling like they belong there, feeling like this is their place. And another thing is, I don't know a good term for it, but equity in innovation. So someone asked me, oh, you're talking about innovation here, how are you defining innovation? And in this case, what I'm talking about is creating something new that produces value, which is a pretty standard definition of innovation. And sometimes these new things that create value create heaps of value for a very small number of people. And a lot of people that are interested in entrepreneurship have this view of the kind of sole entrepreneur, or the small founding group that cash out and become billionaires. And I'm currently working on a project, Science for Technological Innovation, which is a government-funded science innovation project. And a big part of that is saying, how do we create innovation across the whole country? So this idea of equity in innovation, because everyone deserves to have new ideas and create value from them. And I guess you could argue that a lot of new ideas are going to come from places where, maybe there's a lot of latent value, let's say, in places where innovation isn't necessarily getting to, where people are kind of grinding day in, day out. They're not having maybe the opportunity to come up with or realise their new ideas and find value from those ideas, whatever kind of value you might be trying to find. So, those are 2 things I think are really important.
Yeah, actually, I can remember actually going with you one of those trips up to Masterton, and there are some guest speakers from the community. And it's interesting going to the regions, because they're not necessarily the stories that we hear here. We've already mentioned Xero, we could mention Trade Me, we Callahan Innovation is across the road investing in all sorts of amazing technology, but in the regions, the stories are a bit different. An amazing young woman who started a hairdressing business that is really bringing the community together.
Florist, the sustainable florist. She's picking stuff that's local. When you import flowers, they get massively fumigated, and then we put them in our houses and we put our faces in them. And so she's doing, a florist, and you don't really think of that. You think of, trade me's.
Yeah, and I remember it was a guy, a shearing business, running a shearing gang, employing 100 people all around the country and developing some really innovative practices. But those aren't the stories that we hear. And, thinking about, if you like, maybe gross domestic stories, if we could sort of grow that set of what it means to be innovative, I think, as Jesse says, it becomes more equitable. Because I think at the moment, I'm not sure that everyone can see a pathway to be innovative, because they're thinking innovation, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, Sam Morgan. They're not, I don't know whether you had some comment on that.
And
Brad.
I think we've got to move away from that because, look, Xero, Trade Me, all of those guys, absolutely great. But in New Zealand, 90% of our businesses are small, medium enterprises. We hear some of these great success stories, and that's fantastic. But there's a lot of other operators out there that are doing just as well that you might not make it to TV every night. And, for those people on the ground as well, that you say, well, they might employ one additional person. If 90% of the businesses in New Zealand employed one additional person, we'd have to import labour like nobody's business from overseas. So the potential for those small organisations to just make very incremental changes that have much wider benefits is huge. But I also think it goes to what you were saying around what is innovation, because I think too often when we hear innovation, we think R&D and tax credits and similar. And I know, nerdy for a second, but we deal with data and stats all the time. And I remember looking at Stats NZ's research and development survey, and I still to this day don't know exactly how a business answers those surveys, because I don't know from a business point of view what research and development is and what just doing your normal course of business is. I mean, if I'm going to try and develop a new product to get data out to our regional clients, for example, we probably don't call that R&D. We just call that work. And so I think sometimes there's a need to get outside of thinking about R&D in a more academic sense, or sort of, we've got to do a lot of 5 years worth of beta testing before we launch something, that actually, and again, that comes back to the risk profile. When the risk profile is so low, when you can do things without too much of consequences, then you do want to, I think, go a little bit further and be a bit more transformative, because, again, the upside, the benefit potential is huge, and the downside risk is pretty low.
Yeah. Now, before we started, Brad, I said I wasn't going to put you on the spot, but actually I changed my mind about that, because I think this discussion has led in a really interesting direction. And we have a leading economist here, and we've talked about a lot of different value, I suppose, in terms of what people want better to look like. Can we measure that stuff? As an economist, I understand it's easier to measure the financial things, but can we measure the other things that we've been talking about?
I think, the answer to that in a roundabout way is we have to. You can argue whether or not we can measure something to the nth degree, but at the end of the day, if we want to measure progress, we have to understand what's happening. One of the phrases I've always sort of said is that what gets measured gets managed. Because if you don't know about something, then you don't care about it. We all say, for example, in New Zealand that the environment's in a bad state, and that's absolutely true. But if you ask most people how they know that, it's very hard to get it going. So you say, okay, what is it? Is it that we don't recycle enough? Is it because our water quality is bad? Is it because we have too much going into the ozone layer? All those different pieces. Hungry, of course, in the morning. But if you say to people, how is the economy going or whatever, you say, oh, well, I know that spending's doing this and employment's doing that and GDP's doing this other thing and electricity generation's doing blah, blah, blah. So we have to be able to measure things. And that was something as well that with a little bit of effort you can do. 2 years back I put together a table of recycling rates across New Zealand, because again people were saying, well, we're not doing good in the rubbish space. It was like, well, that's cool, but if you can't give me any evidence, no one's going to believe you. And so as stupid as it is, numbers are the currency of decision makers, because if you can make a good case, then you can get things done. And so in Wellington City, for example, we recycle something like 15% of our total waste volume. It's among the lowest in the country, yet Wellington keeps talking about how great it is from an environmental perspective. I think we've put in something like 48% more per capita into the rubbish dump in the last few years. So again, once you start having those numbers, a lot of people go, oh, that's an issue. Now I know that it's an issue, I can see it, and I can start to do some stuff about it. So yes, you can measure it, you just need to, I guess, have a bit of willpower to go forward and sort of break down the door a bit more.
Sure, and that's innovation in measurement, right? So that's good. It says here, and we're nearly, I can see those sort of savories and things over there, so I'm trying to bring this all to a close. It says here, there's an election soon. Do people know that? Okay.
I hope you're all enrolled.
So it says here there's an election year. Well, it is an election year, and we know seriously that there's an election coming up. So I want to sort of, I suppose, conclude by asking each of our panelists, no matter who sort of ends up being, governing the country post the election, if there's one piece of advice that you could give to the new government coming in with regard to innovation, what would that piece of advice be? Should we start with you, Brad?
Yeah, I think firstly it's got to be a partnership. Now, it doesn't matter who it's with, it has to be a partnership, whether it's with iwi, if it's with business, if it's with households. It needs to be something that the government does together rather than sort of just forces upon. And with that, I do think that some sort of digital advancement has got a real power to move businesses and households ahead. We saw back in 2010 how well ultra-fast broadband did. Now, I'd hate to imagine how New Zealand would look if we hadn't made that investment and we'd gone into lockdown. I mean, it would have been abysmal. I still remember, using dial-up when I was at home in Whangarei, and that was the norm until it wasn't. So those sort of advancements, although you might not have felt like they were very important, when push comes to shove, they're critical. So more of that sort of work, and I think from a business point of view, trying to get money to businesses to get over that initial hurdle, because it's expensive to move to online systems. It's expensive to buy that sort of equipment. So you provide a little bit of help to get people over that divide, and I think we're in a really good place to move the country forward. But I am going to have a second bite at the cherry there, and that's because I do think that fundamentally one of the issues we have in this country is around housing, and I expect that this group here is probably going to be unanimous in support for something like that, because Wellington rents are really high and don't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. And so that sort of work there does have the potential to produce some very long-term benefits. It does jobs, it provides better outcomes for people in terms of health, it provides better outcomes for people in terms of their earnings. And so I think actually providing some real step change on our development pipeline for the country, as well as that digital area, are two places that the government could get a lot of mileage out of. And if we're looking, that does good things for jobs, which is great because jobs are measurable and every politician likes to see job numbers, but also it provides that sort of more wider well-being benefit for people.
Right. Thanks, Brad. Jesse?
Something I think we've learnt throughout this whole COVID process is that we can pull together as a team of 5 million and work towards something together. And I think that if the new government can bed down that realisation that we can work together and do amazing things, then it would be a terrible shame to lose that sense across the country now that we have it. So
yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking as you were talking there before about innovation and the way that we have tended to teach it. We've tended to teach innovation as an individual sport, and I think what I'm hearing from you guys and your experiences is that maybe innovation in New Zealand for the future should be more of a team sport. That we should, the case studies that we teach students shouldn't just be Richard Branson or Steve Jobs on their own doing amazing things. It should be focused more on diverse teams working together.
And there are always teams. I mean, I bet that every one of you here, from no matter what area you are, if you go back to the office today and no one else is there, you can't do your job. You can do a fair bit of it, sure. A lot of you are going to be very capable people, but you just can't do it all. I mean, even myself, if I go back to the office today and if the chief forecaster isn't there and if our economist team isn't there, then I can only go so far. And so I think that we do need to recognise that there are no Iron Men in an economy or in a place. There has to be that sort of work together, and that's again why when you look at regions, one of the first things that I talked to someone in the Manawatu, and they said, look, we've pulled together the Chamber of Commerce, the local councils and the local Economic Development Agency, and they made, I think it was an online storefront, because there are a whole lot of businesses that wanted to sell at level 4 and level 3 but couldn't. They were all physical based, and so you couldn't do that. And so they said, well look, we'll host an online, a shop front online, and you can sell your goods through that. That was very quick to do, but again, if you hadn't had all those operators to do it, you wouldn't have got it. If you didn't have the Economic Development Agency, you wouldn't have had the storefront. But if you don't have the businesses, then the storefront's there with no goods to sell. So it has to be a joined-up approach.
Great, thanks very much. We've got some time for questions from the floor. I'm sure people have questions. You're very quick with your hand up. Ask away.
Yeah, sure. Hey, I just had a question about jobs. So you talked about everything being measured, right? But what are the metrics that are being looked at? There's obviously unemployment rate, but it's just saying the issues are a lot deeper than that. They're about where people are working, how well they're being utilised, and about upskilling. How is that being measured, or how can we measure that so that people are up?
Yep, so there's a whole bunch, and I won't get too technical, though happy to talk a bit more detail afterwards. What we've seen through this crisis is also very different from what we normally see in an economy during a crisis. Normally you see jobs cut just straight away, people go. Now the wage subsidy stops some of that, but what you've also seen is what economists thought we'd never really see, which is that sticky wages didn't hold. So the general thinking is that wages only really go up because no one's going to take a pay cut. Apart from when there's a pandemic and everyone says, I'd rather take a 10-20% pay cut than lose my job. So you've seen pay cuts coming through, so even though job numbers might not have fallen all that much, we have seen earnings that have gone down. So looking at earnings per worker is one way to look at it. We've seen that hours have gone down quite a bit as well. So again, someone's still got a job, but they're now working 10 hours instead of 30 hours. Again, that means that there's less money, so you see that in the earnings number, but you also see that in the hours worked. You're right as well in terms of where people are working, both in terms of location and industry, so we do have a bit of a look at that through various sources. What it does show is that those more provincial areas of the economy, particularly with a primary or a food-based economy, are doing particularly well. There is, not only are there jobs there, but they're holding up. Anything with tourism base is in a much tougher position. And in terms of I guess also the regionality, we're seeing that some of our urban centres have had a bit of life sucked out of them. And so I think in terms of when we measure things going forward, that's a conversation that does have to be had in New Zealand, because the last 50 years there's been a move towards urbanisation a bit more. Now you're sort of seeing a bit more of a pullback and people saying, actually, house prices are really high in urban centres. I'd actually like to go out, and live possibly, if I work in Hamilton, for example, I might live in Waipa in Te Awamutu, because I can get there pretty quickly, but I can get a cheaper house and I can get a great lifestyle on a bit of land that I can look after the kids and ride my motorbike in the weekends. So people, I think, are looking for those sort of shifts as well. And so the way of working, the place of work, and also the type of work that people are doing has shifted.
Yeah.
It's generally recognised that siloed ways of working are no longer functional to where we are going and where we need to go. But public sector is notoriously slow to adopt change. And particularly being someone who has worked in the innovation sector, it's frustrating now working in public sector because there's a lot of red tape and there's an enormous amount of bureaucracy. How do we leverage this sort of teamwork mentality to diffuse silos and also to dispel the myth of the Iron Man syndrome? You need to have one person spearheading innovations. How do we leverage this team-based knowledge and inform collaboration?
I think that's a really tough question, but I think it probably actually starts with you, like with people in this room who are thinking, you know what, I want to work a little bit differently, and you just have to go into work and try and find ways to do that. And yes, there's heaps of red tape and organisations are notoriously hard to work with. We complain about it here, but to be honest, it took us 3 weeks to put up this rules of the space. We probably sent 30 emails about that thing. And, we got sucked into it as well. But I think it does start with you, your question about like metrics and like how do we measure what is good about a job, and a question I think for everyone is, what do you do at work that's really good, that's really useful, that's really valuable? And do you know what that is? And if you don't know what it is, how can you find it? So there's a kind of avalanche of information becoming available to us now. So we can tell what you did on your computer, what you wrote, who you wrote stuff to, who you're spending time with, where you are physically in the building. We can tell all of these things, but we still don't quite know what to do with it. And I think, we often think of metrics and big data as this kind of overarching analysis that comes from above, but actually we can do that analysis also from the bottom up. And we have a better sense, I think, of what we're doing at work from ourselves. And so how can we make use of that data? So Yeah, it comes back to you.
I think as well, I mean, make a good case for change because, again, you know, the risks are low, but more importantly, this is a crisis that is, it's completely shifted the foundations, which are still sort of shaking beneath us. And I say that because if you look at the government's response, say, to COVID-19, the Instagram, the Facebook posts and all that are really critical. Now, with all due respect to all of your senior managers who you might talk to later in the day, they're probably not as au fait with Instagram as you might like to have. So if you let them do their old way of thinking, which is to, and I'm being a little bit antagonistic here, but putting stuff in newspapers, for example, or putting things on the TV news. I haven't watched TV news since I had a TV. So for a lot of people, the way of operating is shifted, and so you sort of have to meet people where they are. Now, I say that in terms of making a good case, because if you can prove to someone that your idea is going to get them further along wherever their goal is, then they're completely on board with that. I had a friend who, and actually we did this at our firm, that first week of lockdown, I said to the boss, I said, can I buy a Zoom account on my credit card? He was like, what's a Zoom? And it was like, I want a Zoom account, then we can talk to clients. And he was like, give it a crack. Within a week, we'd talked to, I think it was something like 600 of our clients. We'd never done that in 3 years in total because, you go out for coffee and that's lovely, love talking to clients. But if you don't get in front of them, if you don't change with the times, then, you will eventually not exist. The other thing I think, and it comes back to that also, just having sometimes more informal conversations. So Wellington City Council recognised that, the economy was in a bad place and they had a leading role. They brought together a bunch of stakeholders, that I don't even know what our formal term is, but we meet every fortnight on Zoom. We've got people from retail, from hospitality, from the professional services sector, accounting, law. They've got a random economist on there. But what they're doing there is they're saying, okay, what issues are happening that you can tell us about before they hit the papers? So instead of being reactive, it's proactive. And so I think making that shift of if you can make a good case and if you can address things ahead of time, then people are more likely to take on those good ideas at the moment, because I think everyone recognises that even if they don't like the shift away from siloed thinking, that's where it's moving, and you either have to get on board or you're going to be left behind.
Time for one more question. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, this is of course clouded by personal views, so take it with a grain of salt. I think what we are seeing with the cannabis debate is a lot of people who aren't possibly quite as informed as we might need them to be to vote. The number of people that I've had to tell that this is not about a medicinal cannabis referendum is concerning. There is economic potential in terms of you would be able to tax that. And you'd start to get some money through it. And again, the hope is that you move it from an illegal substance to a legal substance, and then therefore have the regulation and the right healthcare settings around it. I do think that there is still a big social cost no matter what you do, and the hope is that this change would move you further towards being able to support people. I'm personally still dubious of some of the considerations around how much money you'll make, because if there's one thing we've learnt it's that sometimes that illegal market doesn't quite shift as quickly as you might expect it to. So yes, there is economic potential, and I guess the conversation here is, does that potential outweigh the costs? Probably it does. The question is, how well can we measure some of those social costs as well? It's my balanced view.
Hey, I'm sure people have a few more questions. Brad's going to stick around for a little bit longer. Jesse will be here. We've got some coffee and tea. So what I'd like to do is to ask if you'll join me in thanking our wonderful panelists, Brad Olsen and Jesse Pirini. Thanks, guys. As I say, stick around. This space, the Atom Te Kahu Aotearoa, is where our student entrepreneurs work. Student companies, student entrepreneurs are based here. They don't tend to get up that early, though. So the space, stick around in the space, have a coffee, grab a snack, and talk to one another, talk to our panelists. And if you're interested in what we're doing here at Te Hauranga Waka in terms of innovation and entrepreneurship, just look up the Atom Victoria University, and you'll see stories of some of the entrepreneurs and other things that we've got happening here. It's been a great pleasure to welcome you all. Hopefully I'll get around and talk to people as well. So do stick around. It's been fabulous having Brad. I know he's got a busy day, but you're going to be here for a little bit longer. Yeah. So come and have a chat to Brad, get a coffee, stick around for a few minutes if you can. So thanks very much.